The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I sort of feel like a broken record explaining debt and deficit and its importance time and time and time again, but I feel like I sort of should today briefly, just so we're all on the same page about this next story. Countries sometimes run deficits, sometimes they run surpluses. A deficit is when the country spends more than it takes in. A surplus is when the country takes in more than it spends. In and of themselves, deficits can be good or bad. You can deficit spend for economically stimulative reasons, or you can deficit spend for economically non-stimulative reasons. It depends, what are you getting with the deficit spending, and can you carry the interest costs of that deficit and accumulated debt? If you deficit spend to get education for people, rather than deficit spending to put money in rich people's bank accounts that will not be economically stimulative, that should be evaluated differently. It's not all the same. The impact on the economy is not all the same. Having more educated people who then are going to earn more money and more rapidly improve the country, that has a positive external value to the deficit dollars themselves than just putting a little more money in rich people's bank accounts that will sit there and not stimulate the economy. That's like a very general overview. And as we learn more about modern monetary theory and other more modern understandings of debt and deficit in Western countries, debt and deficit is mostly a political football in countries like the United States. The Republican Party likes to pretend that there are just very hard and fast rules about the impact of debt and deficit on the economy, which aren't real. The Republican Party claims to care about it when it's a Democratic president, but all of a sudden, when you've got a Republican president like George W. Bush or Donald Trump that are blowing up the deficit, they don't really seem to care all of a sudden. That gets us to the news this week, which is that for the first time ever, the national debt, the total accumulated debt, has surpassed $22 trillion. Now, of course, even if you reduce the deficit, until you get a surplus, the total amount of debt continues to accumulate larger and larger every single year. What's true about Donald Trump's presidency is that the deficit has gone up significantly, meaning that debt is accumulating much more quickly than it has in a long time. Last year, there was a $779 billion deficit. That's the highest since 2012. So you can care about the debt or not, but you should at least be consistent from Democratic to Republican administrations. Obama slowed down the growth of the debt by reducing the deficit. Republicans didn't care, or they just lied and said it was growing. They then said Trump was going to fix this issue, but he hasn't. He's actually made it worse than in a long time. So why is this happening? Why has the deficit increased so much under Donald Trump? Two primary reasons. Number one, we've been talking a lot this week because people are starting to file taxes. Trump's tax reform plan. That adds about $1.5 trillion over 10 years, or $150 billion per year. That's one element that has increased the deficit. Number two are the budgets that have been passed by the Republican Congress. And part of that is the lower taxes, but it's also other mechanisms that have lowered government revenue and decisions to increase spending. So it's really tough to have a serious conversation about this issue because it has become so politicized. And one way that we might be able to do it is if we separate policy and economics from political posturing. Like, it would be really great if both parties could get past debt and deficit as these political footballs that are thrown back and forth and just agree to some basics. If both sides could agree to just some fundamental truths about budgets and taxes and debt and deficit, we might be able to have better faith conversations. So let's for a second put aside that Trump's a lying hypocrite on this issue, okay? Trump promised to reduce the deficit. He said we'd run a surplus, we would start paying down the debt. The opposite has happened, okay? Any intelligent person, any aware person would have known from the get-go that the policy ideas Trump was espousing were never going to reduce the deficit. Let's ignore that for now and just talk about the economics, okay? Whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president, the nominal amount of debt doesn't really matter, okay? So 22 trillion, it's a record. The economy also continues to grow. The population continues to grow. So relative to the size of the economy, relative to the population, you would anticipate that if those grow, the number of dollars of debt would also grow. So when we say X number of dollars of debt is a problem, that doesn't really tell us anything. Doesn't matter who's president, okay? Bigger country, more debt, everything could still remain relatively balanced. The primary issue that we should be talking about is, for which purposes should the United States deficit spend? If we take on more debt to do tuition-free college, for example, we don't need to, by the way. I told you Monday how we can pay for tuition-free college without new debt. But ignore that for now. Let's say we had the option of taking on debt for tuition-free college. I alluded to this earlier in the segment. People are more educated on average. They get better jobs on average. They have higher earnings on average. More developments come out of the tech world and the medical world and other technological advancements. We could say the debt was worth it because the country got so much out of it. It was a worthwhile way to deficit spend. Let's look at another example. If we say, let's take on more debt simply to give really rich people a tax cut and give them money they don't need and they likely wouldn't spend because the marginal utility of a dollar is much lower to someone who has $1 billion than to someone who has $10,000. That's not a good reason to go into debt. That is really the primary debate. All other debates are secondary to that and extraordinarily politicized. The debt deficit question is actually very complex in many ways, but in our political system, it has been boiled down to deficit bad, surplus good, I'll do this, he'll do that, she'll do the other thing, and is anybody actually telling the truth? The reality is that we have to think much more critically about this because otherwise we're just involved in a race to the bottom. Because think about the possible outcomes. We either say we are just going to focus solely or primarily on reducing the deficit, growing a surplus, and paying down the debt. That's a race to the bottom in that you don't cut your way to prosperity. There is no serious economic analysis which says by doing nothing other than reducing the deficit and starting to pay down the debt, we are going to develop a more prosperous nation. Doesn't happen, okay? There are Republicans who believe that there will be prosperity created merely by the United States paying down the debt. Just not going to happen. No serious economist would tell you that. Once you accept that, then the question becomes, what level of debt that we carry is sustainable for the country? And are there ways that we can deficit spend that are more beneficial than others? And if you accept that framework, which is more of a framework of modern monetary theory, then we can get to the really interesting questions. Let's re-examine the relationship between humans and their jobs and work, for example. Only once we free ourselves from deficit bad, surplus good, I will fix it, nobody else can. We've got to get beyond that in order to have some of those serious conversations. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pacman Show. I will be talking about the 100-year-old or 100-year age limit in Hawaii proposed for buying cigarettes. On today's bonus show, I'm going to talk about the virtual caucus proposal that has been floated for the Iowa Democratic caucuses in 2020. All on the bonus show. But before we get to that, we've got a whole show for you. We will go to the phones. I'm going to answer some audience questions and a lot more. Glad you're with me on this Friday. Follow me on Twitter. Follow the show on Twitter at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Lane Esther. Lane, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Really appreciate your support. You can join Lane at www.joinpakman.com. Coupon code, of course, available. It'll save you 40%. The coupon code is This Is 2020. Also want to say thanks today to George Myers. George Myers, a friend of mine who has been a member for almost 5 years now. George, thank you. Hope to bump into you soon. Lane and George, thanks to both of you. We are mostly funded by memberships. Let's go to the phones at 617-830-4750. Let's see. Let's first go to, you know who's on the phone? Tim is holding on. And last time Tim called in, it was off the rails. And that intrigues me. I'm in an off the rails sort of mood, Tim. What's going on?
Hey, how you doing, David?
Good.
Hey, I just wanted to get your opinion on the Democratic Party. And to me, they seem very fractured with their ideology and what they're really trying to, run for in terms of presidential runs, the ideals. How do you think they're going to beat Trump in 2020?
Well, there's a couple different things in there. On what issue do you see the Democratic Party as being fractured or divided?
So I see people like Liz Warren, they go really far left, which is a minority within the party. You also have a lot of centrists that are going in that are, talking about, war and, funding these wars and funding Israel and all these different places. And they seem to have different ideologies going in multiple different directions.
Okay, so let's explore that. Let's hold on. Let's slow down because there's a lot there. Let's really think it through. What would be, Let's first start with the first example. What's an Elizabeth Warren far left position that's out of step with the voters?
The Green New Deal, her signing on to that, and Medicare for all.
Okay, and in what way are those things out of step with the American left? Those seem to be things that the American left wants.
Well, the American left, a lot of them are centrists. So you're talking about far left policies like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, where they don't want us to have any more.
Medicare for all is not far left. Like every other country at our level of development has it.
No, what do you mean our level of development? In what way? You're talking about the Nordic countries?
No, I'm talking about Canada. We're talking about Germany. We're talking about the UK, the Nordic countries as well. I mean, I don't think to say that that's an extremist position. Every candidate at least has expressed some support for Medicare for all. So that doesn't seem to be something we can say Elizabeth Warren is doing that's outside of the mainstream. Can you think of any candidate that has straight up said they don't want Medicare for all so far?
Well, let's say on topic. I'm saying Medicare for all. Let me defend the reason why I think Medicare for all is a far left position is because no one has been able to answer specifically how it's going to be paid for.
Completely
and I think
untrue.
What you're saying
absolutely and completely untrue. Everybody from Bernie Sanders to economists like Gerald Friedman to even Koch-funded think tanks have put out proposals identifying exactly what it would cost and how it would be paid for. So that's just wrong. But I want to go back to
how is it going to be paid for? You're changing the subject. You're changing the subject.
Hold on a second, though. You brought up how it was going to be paid for. How did I change the subject?
No, you're changing the subject because you're trying to pivot and not actually answering my question on how it's going to be paid for. You're just saying who says it's going to be paid for, and they don't give any answers to how it's going to be paid for. And people want affordable care. They want affordable care.
Tim. Let me understand why you're all over the place. Your first assertion, which we tried
I'm not. I'm on Medicare for all.
Tim, hold on a second. Hold on. Your first assertion, which you mentioned as just in passing, was that Elizabeth Warren is far to the left of the Democratic Party. And I asked for an example, and you cited Medicare for all.
And the Green New Deal.
Hold on a second, Tim. I pointed out, by the way, every candidate so far has also said they're into the Green New Deal, but let's just focus on one at a time.
Which is hilarious, but okay.
Hilarious is different than untrue, right? So first you said it was untrue. So let's stay focused here, Tim. You said Elizabeth Warren is saying things that are to the left of the Democratic Party. You cited Medicare for all. I pointed out every single candidate on the left has expressed some degree of support for Medicare for all. You then brought up that no one has a plan to pay for it. And I told you that actually there are multiple plans. And then you accused me of changing the subject, even though I was merely following you.
No. I asked, how is it going to be paid for? You still haven't provided the answer. And I'm also talking about the Green New Deal, which was laughed at.
Tim, one question at a time.
Okay.
You asked most recently, how is it going to be paid for? And now I will tell you, after pointing out you've changed the subject 3 times, it will be paid for by a 7.5% employer payroll tax after accepting the first $2 million per year of payroll, which saves small businesses from having to pay that, and a 4% tax on the employee side after the first $29,000 per year of income. That's how it will be paid for.
That doesn't make any sense. You're talking about trillions of dollars. That's not enough, David.
It is enough.
That's
We've looked
not
at the
enough.
numbers. Tim, I'm going to let you go because I got a
What
bunch of
number?
people holding, but we've looked at it a whole bunch of times. It's an additional $1 trillion a year, and we know exactly how it would be paid for. Let's go to our caller from the 918 area code. Caller from 918. Who's there?
It's Benjamin. David, how are you doing?
Hey, Benjamin, go ahead.
And so this isn't really like a question. I mean, I guess it kind of is. So let's say 2020 comes around and Bernie wins the Democratic nomination and he goes against Trump and he loses, which I don't think will happen.
Okay.
But let's say it did. What would like plan B? Like if our holy, like just like the holy man himself, Bernie won Democratic nomination and got to Trump and he lost. Like what would be plan B after that?
Well, then you've got 4 more years of Trump. I mean, Plan A was not letting Trump win in 2016. We're already on Plan B, which is defeat Trump in 2020. If we lose in 2020, then I mean there is no Plan B. That's we're trying to execute Plan B right now, which is to get Trump out. So I don't know what you got to wait till the next election, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm
like
missing
Bernie
maybe
lost
a different
against Trump.
aspect of the question, but that's exactly what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, no, I don't think he would lose against Trump, and I get we're trying to avoid that, but it's more of like, well, because that's what like we say, like the left is like, that's who's going to defeat Trump is Bernie, and I'm more thinking like what would be the course of action if 2020 comes around, Bernie loses, like the progressive ideas that he, advocates for, it just didn't hold up to the American voters with Trump. Like, what would Plan C be? Like, would it keep pushing that message?
Yeah, you try to win in 2022 and in 2024. I don't know. I mean, your question is in a sense a very straightforward one, but in a sense it's sort of like a deep question, which is, do the progressive values that are increasingly popular in the United States, like for example, a more equitable economic system, healthcare for all, if those progressive values sort of lose at the ballot box, it sounds like you're asking, should they be abandoned to some degree?
I don't think they should be abandoned for the reason that I just genuinely believe like those are policies that are going to like help people. And I would hope that we would keep fighting for it. But it's also like, that's how I would do it. And that's how a lot of people on like the progressive side would go about it. But then you have like the Democratic Party, where if that ever happened, then I just think they would just completely just dismiss all of Bernie's policies and all of the progressive agenda.
You might be right, and that would be really dangerous. I don't think that there's any long-term strategy that is abandoning our values and pretending to be centrists. I just don't think that that's the way that over the long term we're going to win, particularly when the American people are to the left of the legislative bodies of the House and Senate as it is. So I don't think that's the right path forward. I think we've got to fix the voting system. We've got to fix the campaign finance system. We've got to fix what's going on with media consolidation and the way that the propaganda machine creates this vicious circle. So listen, if Bernie wins the primary and loses in 2020, that's horrible. But we don't say, let's now be centrists. I think that that's a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Thank you for the call. Really appreciate it. Great to hear from you. Let's go to our caller from the 503 area code. Who's there from 503 today? 503, are you muted or I don't know?
Hey, David.
Hey, who's this?
Getting off the headset.
Oh, okay.
Hey, my name's Steven.
Steven, go ahead.
Hey, so I was hoping, maybe somebody's already done it, but I was hoping we could talk about the Ilhan Omar tweet controversy.
Sure.
Okay. So, I wanted to talk about that being an anti-Semitic trope, and kind of your view on it. Do you think she was invoking that on purpose, or was it kind of inadvertent?
I don't know. I mentioned in my segment that I don't know whether she was deliberately fomenting an anti-Semitic trope or not, and that I don't know whether she's personally anti-Semitic or not.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Just want to clarify. So my opinion on it was that she wasn't, just because the context of the conversation was around the Israeli lobbying presence in the U.S. Is it fair to say that if we're bringing up anti-Semitic trope, it should be about the Jewish race or religion or people rather than that?
Sorry, if we're bringing up anti-Semitic tropes, then what should be about the Jewish race or religion? What do you mean?
The context on the conversation. So if we're talking about like a government,
okay,
versus the religion, can we still be anti-Semitic if criticizing those things, or is it different?
Well, it depends on what the context is. I mean, there's this phrase that people like to talk about, which is being anti-Israeli is not anti-Semitic. And of course, that's true in a sort of literal sense. Yeah. But there is anti-Israeli sentiment that is pretty weak cover for anti-Semitism. So there's no one answer. I mean, definitionally, an anti-Israeli statement is, of course, not anti-Semitic.
Exactly. Okay. I just want to clarify. There's a lot of comments, about that in particular, and just straightforward. I think there's a lot of miscommunication between you and the audience in terms of like where people align. I think a lot of the audience landed on the side of she wasn't specifically talking about the Jewish race or religion or people, and so therefore that tweet wasn't anti-Semitic. But to me, it seems like your point was, Jews plus money is an old trope that's existed for a long time, and that's true no matter what, right?
It's not a question of listen, it's true no matter what that trope has existed for a long time. It's more than just looking at one tweet and analyzing what exactly was in her head. You have to look at the combination of both tweets, the reality that it all started related to this Republican Congressman, Kevin McCarthy, who has not actually received any money from AIPAC, even though her second tweet said that the money is coming from AIPAC. You have to look at it more systemically, and I'm totally fine if the audience is more in disagreement with me on this issue than with others. I think that the most important thing that I would say is I don't sort of restate my views differently merely because we find a point of greater disagreement with the audience. I think that's how a lot of people end up sort of putting themselves into positional corners merely because they're trying to kind of calculate what will their audience like best. It's great and it's fine if we have areas where the audience more agrees with me or less agrees with me, as long as we're sort of like having reasonable discussions in good faith about it, kind of like you and I have been doing in the last few minutes.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that I've always appreciated about the work that you've done. I disagree with you on this. I think that's pretty clear at this point, but I'm not going to stop watching your show. I'm still going to watch every single episode.
All right. Very good. Well, some people have. Some people have canceled their memberships as a result of that story. And I'm glad you're not doing that.
I'm not going to do that. Yeah. I did have one final question, and I'll ask you if this is a fair opinion to have. When it comes to McCarthy, so he's a minority leader, and it's true that he's not received any AIPAC funds. Is it fair to say that he could be influenced by those funds because his fellow colleagues do receive those funds and he's in a leadership position?
It's a totally reasonable assertion to make, but if that's your defense, you really should be able to demonstrate exactly how, rather than to just kind of generally say, that's probably what she meant and therefore it's okay, because it's a very speculative defense.
Yeah, I agree with that. But in my mind, when I was thinking it over, that's the first thing that went through. But you're the master of breaking these things down, so I wanted to run it by you.
Here's I think here's a really important thing, and this comes from moral psychology. All of us, myself included, we very frequently do what are called post facto rationalizations. We believe that the facts are leading us to our opinions, but very, very frequently we have an initial reaction that comes from sort of passion or gut or instinct, and then we look to rationalize it after the fact. My concern in hearing you say, well, he could still be influenced indirectly by colleagues who are AIPAC funded, is that it strikes me as one of those post hoc rationalizations.
Yeah, and it's extremely vague, and that could be just abused in any number of subjects. So that's why I immediately questioned myself, and I wanted to ask you about it as well.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate the call. Thanks so much for calling in. We will take a quick break. If you're holding, don't hang up because we are going right back to the phones after the break. Quick break and right back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
A lot of people holding at 617-830-4750. Let's go next to our caller from the 608 area code. Caller from 608, who's there? 608, you might be muted.
Is this me?
That is you. Who's this?
Hi, this is Jeremy from Wisconsin.
Hey, Jeremy, what's going on?
Hey, I was just wondering about your position on the recent Venezuelan controversy surrounding Maduro. I saw a video you made about how people in the progressive movement are kind of overlooking the evils of the Venezuelan government, and I was wondering what your solution would be towards getting Maduro out of office.
Yeah, I don't know that I used the term evil necessarily, but I've pointed out that whatever your position is on American intervention, and I'm against it, to be very clear, that Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez, were not beacons of progressive populism beyond their rhetoric and are actually hugely authoritarian leaders, much more reminiscent of the folks that usually the left would not be aligned with. So I think that this is an area of some disagreement with my audience. I think the confusion is coming in that I am pointing out that there are reflexive defenses of Maduro coming from some areas of the left that are focused only on American interventionism, or the word colonialism or imperialism is thrown out there. And I've been accused by some, it's sort of shocking because I've never said anything of the sort, that because I'm opposed to Nicolas Maduro, that I somehow support American intervention or invasions for oil or whatever. That's simply not the case. So I think, I don't know exactly how do you get Maduro out. I don't know the answer to that. But I think it's important.
What I was thinking.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But what I was thinking was, this kind of goes to a question of the strength of international bodies, like the UN, for example.
Yep.
Having a body that, coalesces different governments and is able to establish if a regime is legitimate or not and can take recourse. But I think people are just, sort of like you said, reflexively pushing back against, American intervention, and they're taking out on you, which I know you didn't say you want America to go in, but that's typically the rhetoric people use. They talk about how evil Maduro is, and they rationalize that with trying to push America into Venezuela to get more resources.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a sort of a special pleading going on because I'm against, I don't like President Erdogan. I don't like Kim Jong-un. I don't like Vladimir Putin. I don't like Bashar al-Assad. I don't like the Qatari royal family. I'm not an authoritarian, Saudi Arabia. That doesn't mean that I'm supportive of American-led regime change in those places, right? And I think that it's really important to take these things in their component parts.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you for the call.
Okay, appreciate your call. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see who is next today. There are so many people holding today. Let's go to the 951 area code. Who's this from 951?
Sorry. This is Blair.
Hey, Blair, what's going on?
It's going well. David, I have a question for you that I wrote a long time ago about, it's a climate change question, so I'll just read it off and I'll take my question off the air.
Okay.
So I said, David, given that you believe that the socialist principle is inherently authoritarian, which I wholeheartedly agree with, after all, the socialist principle states that each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which I believe is an inherently authoritarian principle to be the motivating factor within the society because of the LeBron James argument. And if you want to explain that to your viewers, go ahead. Now, with that being said, how can you reconcile being a social democrat when a free market capitalist society cannot stop the threat of climate change that is surely coming for all of us? Perhaps the means of production will have to be controlled by a global government one day very soon. So do you think you are being unrealistic about the threats that face us all? The IPCC estimate where is this? Is conservative at best because they exclude Arctic and Antarctic data from their models. And even the Trump administration says that this planet will warm by 7 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. If that happens, David, people like you and I are going to be caught up in the middle, because we're going to be old, in the middle of this shit in our 50s and 60s, trying to survive, hoping for some science fiction technology to save us. This is a lot to unpack, so I'll take my answer off there.
Okay, yeah, if you can just hold on for 1 second. The problem with the question as asked is that there's no way to really just answer it, because it's sort of throwing together a whole bunch of different things, which are sometimes only tangentially related. You're talking about, in a way, is socialism the only way to actually deal with climate change? You're mixing in there the different, you're sort of conflating so-called free market capitalism with well-regulated Nordic-style capitalism. So I think that there's no way for me to just kind of like answer the question, but I think it's been laid out pretty extensively how well-regulated Nordic-style capitalism, what many of us know as social democracy, actually can deal with the issue of climate change. I also don't believe it's been proven that socialism would necessarily deal with it either. So I think we've got to kind of reset the framing maybe a little bit. Okay, I guess he did hang up and really wanted me to answer the question off air. Okay, I think the question is flawed at its sort of core level. Let's go next to the 513 area code. Caller from 513. Who's there?
Hey, is this me?
That's you. Yeah, who's this?
Oh, this is Vivek from Ohio.
Go ahead, Vivek.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with that's kind of a philosophical question, if you're familiar with the concepts of free will and determinism.
Yes, I am.
So would you say that you believe basically in determinism, or at least that free will doesn't exist?
This is such a bigger question, and I've read so much about this. I sort of am of the mindset, you might be shocked to hear this as someone who is so often espoused that I don't think most things in life are black and white. I don't see it as one or the other in the literal sense. I think that this is sort of like the moral relativism question, which is there's often a debate where it's like, is moral relativism, are you a moral relativist or not? Do you believe in free will or determinism? With free will and determinism, the best sort of explanation that most resonated with me has been that there is, of course, some degree of determinism for humans in the sense that everything that has happened came from the initial creation of the universe, and we are made of star stuff, and there is sort of there are limited confines within which humans exist as sort of biological carbon-based beings. So like in a sense, there is some narrowing scope in terms of what it is that any one human is going to do. Beyond that, the question of whether every single one of our actions is sort of predictable, if only we had the right machine, everything we are bound to do is already predetermined in a literal sense. I don't know the answer to that, and quite frankly, it doesn't even seem like that important of a question for how each of us lives our life on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so for me, the way that I like to think about it is that believing in determinism, or at least that free will doesn't exist, like there are obviously some theories that include quantum randomness, so that we can't predict even if we were able to measure everything. But the way that I like to think about it is that it gives me a better understanding of why people do the things that they do. Allows me to think about perhaps somebody's upbringing, what leads them to become a criminal, for example. That's the way that I like to think about it.
There's another element to this, and Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, I don't know if that's a book you've read. He talks about how even if once you sort of determine where you are on the spectrum between free will and determinism, the real world is probabilistic in the sense that even with a certain, this is why we talk about confidence intervals. You can say that with these inputs, 95% of the time, the results will fall within these sort of parameters. But 5% of the time, they won't. So even if there's a very strong deterministic sort of underpinning to human life and the universe and the world, we're still dealing in a probabilistic circumstance. And that's why, you know, when you talk about upbringing, if 95% of the time a certain upbringing will lead to someone being conservative, that's not 100% of the time. And even if those inputs are deterministic to a great degree, it's not 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think maybe we've said everything that we can right now. Thank you for the call. I appreciate it very much. Okay, let's go next to our caller from the 206 area code. Who's there from 206?
Hi, is this me?
That is you. Yeah, who's this?
Hi, this is Leon in Seattle.
Hey, Leon.
Hey, first of all, this is pretty cool that I'm actually on this line. I thought about calling in for a little while, but I wasn't sure about timing, and I'm a longtime fan. So
awesome.
Thanks for the content.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question about the recent tweets in regards to Israel. I'm sure you've probably gotten a few of them. I'm kind of agreement with your final point in that.
Wait, hold on a second. Let me back up just a second. Did I tweet something about Israel?
Oh no, Ilman.
Oh, Ilhan Omar's tweets.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I kind of agree with your final point in your video about one can understand that these comments may or may not play on tropes for a specific group or identity, and still, for example, in this specific scenario, support boycotting Israel. And so for me, it just kind of begs to a question, because I know that recently you took a call from someone in regards to AOC, and essentially your point was that in regards to criticizing her and whether or not criticisms of her are sexist or racist, and I believe you brought an analogy towards Sarah Palin. So I guess I just wanted to see how you reconcile those two things, because the way I see it is we can retroactively see that these are playing on tropes, but it doesn't necessarily take away from the validity of the actual statement.
I have no idea what you mean. I apologize. So you want me to reconcile which two things and which tropes do or don't take away from the validity of which particular argument?
Yeah, and by the way,
that was a question. That was a question. I'm trying to understand.
No, I know. Yeah, and I'm gonna. Yeah, I just want to say beforehand, I didn't have my question ready, so I do apologize for that. I kind of called very last minute because I just saw that you had a video for a call, but essentially it's so as a leftist we can say, okay, there is a trope about Jewish globalism and Jews controlling money.
Got it.
And that these statements may or may not can be viewed as, okay, this validates my racist, anti-Semitic, George Soros-themed Jews control everything.
Okay.
But we can still be like, hey, AIPAC is a problem, and the far-right government in Israel is a problem.
Right.
So I just don't see how, and again, I apologize, I didn't have my question ready. I didn't reference the last video. I just remember having seen it and having thought to myself, you can understand that people questioning AOC's intelligence plays into tropes about women, and specifically women of color not necessarily being intelligent, but you can still maintain, any criticism you might have of her or of her statements.
Okay, I apologize. I just don't understand the question, but let me put it this way. I am against the right-wing government. I'm against the right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel, And I share the concern of those who believe that the tweets from Ilhan Omar, without necessarily indicating that she's personally anti-Semitic, certainly didn't help the fact that there is this trope about Jewish conspiracy to control via the use of money. So that, I mean, that's how I reconcile it. That's just my view. It's very loud where you are, so I'm going to let you go. And on that note, I'm going to go to a break. Sorry to everybody who is holding, who I didn't get to. We'll take calls again, and I look forward to hearing from you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let's get into audience questions for the week. First one today is from Sarah. Sarah says, hey, David, you've talked about making Election Day a holiday in the United States, and that town in Ohio actually did it. What about mail-in ballots? Isn't that actually overall a better system? Okay, so this is a great idea. So let's go back to what we're trying to do. The idea is for more people to vote. Right now, you only have, in presidential elections, roughly half the country votes. Sometimes it's 45%, 55%, depending on, is it a midterm? Is it a particularly interesting presidential election or whatever else? That's not great. I, as a progressive, want as much involvement. I want the country to be as involved as possible in the process of selecting our leaders. Not voting is not a neutral act. In other words, when you don't vote, you're not saying I have no influence. You're saying I'm going to have an influence in that my vote will not be there, meaning everybody else's vote now counts a little more, and I am choosing to just allow other people to decide. That has an impact, and in general, the impact is making our elected officials in total more conservative than the people that they represent. So we want more people to vote. That's what I want. I think that would be important. We've got all the voter suppression that we're dealing with. And then on the other side of it, there are ideas about how we might increase voter turnout. One idea is you make Election Day a holiday. That could be keeping it on Tuesday. It would be hard in the United States to move Election Day to a different day, but in other countries, they have election days on weekends. A lot of people work on weekends. So again, if you don't make it a holiday, you're still going to sort of have an issue with people who are not going to ask for the time off to vote because, yeah, you can't get fired for going to vote, but if you're an hourly worker, you're just not going to get paid. So one idea is you make Election Day a holiday, and that helps in one way. A bigger idea is you switch to mail-in ballots, and people, doesn't matter whether you work on weekends or weekdays or whether you work second shift or first shift or whatever else, you have some period of time, many days, a couple weeks, depending on how it's set up, to fill out and send in your ballot. This is good for a number of reasons. Number one, it expands. It's no longer just 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or whatever the voting hours are during which you can vote. So if that's what was holding you back from voting, it eliminates that. It eliminates the possibility of polling place electioneering, which is another problem that we're dealing with. It eliminates the possibility of in-person voter suppression, people coming through lines and saying inaccurate things about what IDs are required or scaring people off in some other ways that we've covered over the last many years on the program. You deal with the possibility of voting machines in the moment not working. You send your ballot in, you fill it out, you have time to review candidates and all of that stuff. Although where the ballot is received by mail, it could still be processed by a voting machine that could have an issue. So I think that mail-in ballots is absolutely a fantastic idea. Right now, you have to request an absentee ballot if you're going to vote by mail. It has to be approved. There are only certain reasons why you're allowed to do it, although the strictness with which that's applied sort of varies from state to state. So I am absolutely and completely all for it and think it would be much better than Election Day simply being a holiday. The issues that exist with it are all issues because of right-wing voter suppression. We actually saw it in Georgia in the midterm election with the gubernatorial race. You can have slick workers, campaign workers, who decide to show up at people's houses and say, I'm here to collect the ballots, and people who are unsure about what to do or maybe don't realize that that's crazy, that you've got to mail it. They might turn over their ballot to someone who is claiming to be an election official, but is actually just a partisan political operative. Those are the types of problems that can come up with mail-in ballots, but that's just an awareness thing. If we put in place vote by mail, you do an awareness campaign that says, do not hand your ballot to anyone. Do not do anything other than sealing the ballot. Usually you put it inside of another. Sometimes you put it inside of another envelope, like there's two envelopes. Sometimes there isn't. And mail it. That's it. Don't hand it to anyone. Drop it in a post office. Drop it off at the post office or in a mail slot or whatever. If you know your USPS worker, okay, you hand it to them because they're actually somebody that works for the post office. That is it. And we could solve that with an awareness campaign. So I'm totally for mail-in ballots. I'm not against making Election Day a holiday, but I think mail-in ballots would be fantastic. Hey, David, says Don, if we can't get Medicare for all, what are ways that we could improve the Affordable Care Act? This is so, I want to deal with the question because it's a good one, but it's also so politically loaded right now because we're seeing this battle within the Democratic Party. I will remind you, the position of the Democratic Party platform right now, if you go to their website, is not Medicare for all. It's not eliminate private insurance. It's not universal health care. It's not any of that stuff. It is Medicare opt-in at age 55, lower the age at which you can opt into Medicare from 65 to 55, and a public option. That's the Democratic position. And so we're seeing among Democratic candidates is they are being forced to take a position on Medicare for all. They're all paying lip service to it, but some are already kind of backing away. We've seen Kamala Harris back away after saying during a town hall, Medicare for all is the way. We've seen Cory Booker start to play a little coy with it. We're seeing others. So I'll give you the full list when we dive into that in depth. And so I will address the question of how, if we don't have Medicare for all, how could we improve the system we have or build on the Affordable Care Act? Just remember that this has become a very, very toxic thing related to the 2020 presidential election. It's being used by a lot of people to play games and to try to have it both ways and ride the fence in a way that we really shouldn't allow them to. That being said, how do we improve the Affordable Care Act? Number one, you've got to put right back in the individual health care mandate that Donald Trump removed via his tax reform plan. You've got to do that. That's how it's sustainable. Period. And for everybody who says, well, it's not really free stuff if we're paying for it through taxes. Yeah, no one is saying that any of this stuff is free. No one's saying Medicare for all is free. We did a piece on Monday estimating that Medicare for all would add about $1.2 trillion in costs per year. The problem is that we can, or not the problem, the great news is that we can more than pay for that through means that have been very specifically researched and outlined. And it would be at a net savings to employers and individual households. A 4% tax on households earning more than $29,000, for example, considering that most households spend between $4,000 and $5,000 a year on premiums and copays, it's going to save most households money, right? So just because something has a cost, it's like, okay, but what are the savings? So we should absolutely put back in the individual mandate. You need that for the system to function properly. We should add an actual public option. Okay, I'm not talking about a state subsidized option, although that's good. And we've had that here in Massachusetts for a long time. I'm not talking about really crappy, cheap, catastrophic only plans that cover nothing but are just there to meet the requirements of the individual mandate. I'm saying a genuine public option. And in addition to that, we also need to continue examining what is going on with bureaucracy and bureaucratic costs. That's a huge driver of costs in the American healthcare industry. And then you can start looking at, all sorts of other things. We should be negotiating on drugs. There's no reason why Americans, through insurance that is mostly coming through employers, should be paying outrageous costs for medications that go for a fraction of the cost in other countries. It's a very, very long list, but public option and putting the individual mandate back in would be near the top of that list. But I just reject on principle that there's something untenable about actually figuring out how to get universal health care, single payer, Medicare for all, some version of that, which every other country at our level of development has been able to do. Last question today. Hey, David, when are you going to formally decide who you're supporting in the 2020 Democratic primary? I don't have a date. We need all the candidates first, right? And we also need time for all of the candidates to figure out what their positions are on a variety of different important issues. So number one, I'm just not going to decide until it's clear that we have all of the serious candidates that we're going to have. Right now, we don't even know who the serious candidates are, although we can get an idea based on who they are as people. We need to wait to ensure that we are choosing. I think it's important to choose candidates that are actually on the ballot in enough states to get 270 electoral votes. There are people who get on the ballot in a couple of states, but aren't even running formally in enough states to get 270 electoral votes and win the presidency. I'm not interested in voting for those people because the number one priority is we've got to get Trump out, right? And it would not make sense to support someone who can't even actually win. Healthcare is an issue where you're seeing so far every candidate pay lip service to Medicare for all, but some are already backing off of it. So we need to see debates. So I don't know when it is that I'm going to make the determination as to who I'm supporting, but it's certainly not now because we need all of the candidates who are running to say that they're running. I need to start digging in more depth to their final platforms. I may even want to see some debates before I fully decide. And I'm not shy about telling you that the people I'm most interested in right now are Elizabeth Warren and Andrew Yang at this point. I want to see if Bernie's running. I want to see what actually happens during debates and are people softening on policies that I think are the most important. So I'm not in any particular rush. I have never been one of these late undecideds. When it's September and you don't know who you're supporting, that's weird. That I don't understand how that's possible. Now, of course, that's a general election. And likewise, if it's 2 weeks before the end of, before your state votes in the primary or caucus and you still don't know, I quite frankly also think that's weird. Like it should, if you're paying attention, you should really have been able to figure that out with plenty of time remaining before it's time to vote. So I'll let you know. I am not playing coy in the sense of hiding who I'm leaning towards. I've been clear about who's most appealing to me right now. And I assure you, you will know it when I make a decision as to who I'm supporting. We've got a great bonus show for you today. What is the bonus show? The bonus show is another show. Every day we do this show, and then we do another show for our paid subscribers. And you can access that by being a member. You can sign up at joinpacman.com. That's www.joinpacman.com. Some people think I'm saying you should join pacman.com. And I don't own pacman.com. The other David Pacman owns pacman.com. So it's www.joinpacman.com. Or become a patron at the $5 or greater level at patreon.com/David Pacman Show. I'll speak to you on the bonus show in just a minute or two, and otherwise, see you back here on Monday.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.